Welcome to Local 514. I'm your host, Savannah Craig. In today's episode, we'll be looking into femicides as well as the decriminalization of sex work. On Tuesday, Montreal commemorated the anniversary of the Polytechnique shooting that happened 32 years ago. A gunman entered the school, separating the women and men, and killed 14 women on that day before turning the gun on himself. Montreal Mayor Valérie Plante said, "It's a time to reflect as a society on what we can do to better protect women." So how much reflection do we need to do? This year, a suspected 15 women were killed by femicides in Quebec. In some situations, these were by their own partners, suspected to be aggravated by the lockdown and limiting the ability for these women to leave their situations and seek help. So what do we need to do as a society to better protect these women and reduce femicides? I'm joined today by Chanel, a volunteer at Women Aware, an organization established by survivors to support survivors of domestic violence. Hi, Chanel. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
So we last spoke earlier this year when I covered femicides for the show. At the time we spoke, there were eight femicides, 8 deaths within 8 weeks. Now, as for 2021, we're at 15 deaths. Do you have any thoughts on this that you'd be willing to share?
I have so many. It's actually, I didn't realize that the time that we spoke before there were 8 and now there are so many more. It's not an easy, one is a tough number, but 15 plus it's mind blowing. It's, and it happens like one after the other, after the other, after the other. So there's no real pause in it. Despite everyone's efforts to kind of curb it and to raise awareness and all of that. So it's tough. It's tough to stomach. It's tough to swallow. But organizations like Women Aware are doing the best that we can. However, there are too many abusers in this world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How has Women Aware been dealing, with this? Not only the increase in deaths, but just during the pandemic, the increase in need for support?
Well, because of all of our media appearances, interviews, all the spotlight that goes on when someone is murdered, we have received an outpouring of hotline calls of people trying to seek help. Through that, also, we have received a lot of people who want to volunteer. So it's really great for us because we're all volunteer based, right? So we all have our own jobs and everything. And it's always great to have new volunteers with lived experience because to facilitate the numbers that of calls that we're getting. So, we're just doing our best. We've started back the group support therapy sessions, and they're run by our one volunteer psychologist and also another one of our own peer support volunteers. So it's small groups of women who are meeting on Zoom right now because of the pandemic. And they're meeting on Zoom right now just so that they can be alongside women who are also experiencing similar situations to them. So that has been a huge thing that we started back up this year. It stopped for a while. And we're just trying to get out there as much as possible with information and trying to do the best that we can in this situation.
Thank you. As well as last time when we spoke, yourself and other folks from different organizations who are supporting survivors of domestic violence, you all kind of channeled a similar thing, that there was a bit of a lack of funding and support from the government. Is this something that is continuing today?
Of course. The government is trying to do their part by giving us funding and by providing certain things to us. But in these numbers that we're seeing over the pandemic and just in general, yes, it's good to have funding for all of our centers and shelters and everything. However, we're mainly looking at how we can increase prevention. So yes, the funding is a huge part of our services and what we can and can't do, but we're really trying to increase prevention and to figure out how it can slow down the murders, or how we can educate people, children, men, women alike. We're trying to reach out to police stations as well to do workshops with them. However, it's, I don't want to speak ill of the SPVM, but they're not very receptive to that. And so we're just trying to figure out now how we can get the process moving, whether it be workshops in the CEGEP police tech programs. So we can start kind of younger and get that moving too. We can always use funding. We are all of these centers and Women Aware included are all volunteer based. So we, like I said before, we're all volunteers, but we all have our own jobs to handle and to deal with. And so, since we're volunteers, we don't get paid for doing this work, which is totally fine. However, it's good to have funding so that we can be available to do more workshops and to offer more services once life gets back to in-person more than Zoom.
I wanted to go back to something you were saying earlier about, when you give media interviews in general, and Women Aware is providing interviews to the media, there's an increase in calls to your hotline. Would you say this is because, the media attention maybe makes women in these situations possibly, come to the harsh reality of what could happen if they stay in, they're in situations with an abusive partner, or is it maybe something else?
I would say yes, for sure, that exact point. We have been doing media interviews with you. We've been doing them for the news reports. We did one on CJAD, which was our first radio interview, and we actually received 2 hotline calls from that interview, from someone saying from people who said that they heard the interview and didn't realize that what they were experiencing was in fact a form of conjugal violence. So we're trying to reach out as much as possible in every avenue that is possible, because of course not everyone watches the news, not everyone listens to radio stations. So we're just trying to get anything and everything out there as much as we possibly can. And yes, I think it's directly related to that, because once another femicide is in the news, we're asked to comment on it, and then people would hear about it, and either friends or family too. We have a lot of concerned family members or friends calling our hotline as well, mentioning that they know someone or someone in their family is experiencing a conjugal violent relationship, and they just want tips on how to proceed with this person, what they should do, what they shouldn't do, should they intervene, should they not. So any conversation, I think, in terms of this kind of situation is a good conversation to have. It's always better to talk about what's going on, because you never, even if it helps one person, it's one person.
Mm-hmm. As Montreal just commemorated the loss of the 14 women killed by the femicides at Polytechnique, do you think that Montreal and Quebec as well are doing enough to support and protect women?
I think that they're doing what they can. However, it reaches beyond funding, it reaches beyond that. There are so many different problems that intersect with this problem, like how women as a whole aren't believed, let's say. And so this is seen with the police, this is seen in the court system. We also are very lacking in terms of affordable housing for people who need to move quickly and be in a safe environment. So, I mean, it deals with everything, like race comes into play, gender comes into play, sexual orientation comes into play. So it's not just this problem. It's like, this might be the crux of our problem and what we're trying to achieve here, but there's so many factors around this that makes it so that the government would have to interject in all of these kind of areas in order to better facilitate and handle this issue, I think.
Do you think that this could be addressed? I'm sure there are numerous things, but one of them may be, I guess, early prevention in education, anywhere from elementary to high school on these matters?
Absolutely. I mean, we received, I think it was earlier this year, we received a call from a school in Montreal, a high school in Montreal, asking us to come in or do a Zoom workshop about this, because a lot of their students were being affected by it. And that's the thing that we're trying to do more, is prevention. Because I mean, in high school, maybe someone won't hit their partner, but they might be very controlling in terms of the social media, in terms of checking their phone, and these things escalate because, as we know, conjugal violence is not about anything other than control. So you don't need to be violent to be controlling. You don't need to be this big tough person to be controlling. It takes many forms, and so that's what we're trying to do, is get into schools, get into CEGEPs, and just talk about it, because so many people experience it without realizing that they're experiencing it, and it's, I mean, I can even give an example of, like, when you're a kid and you're being like teased in the playground and your parents are like, oh, well, if he's pulling your hair, that means he likes you, like off the top of your head, you don't really think, you don't see an issue with that. But then as you grow up with these little things being planted in your mind, you think that this is a form of love or affection. If somebody is hurting you, that means that they like you. So it's really to change the whole rhetoric in terms of what kind of information we feed our kids, what kind of situations we show for them, and keep that as they get older. Obviously, it has to be age appropriate at a certain time, and but just as a whole, it should be about mutual respect. As young kids grow up, maybe they don't know the difference between like conjugal violent relationships. They wouldn't know what that means, but if you teach them about mutual respect, it would flow better when they get older and they start to learn about these things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Could you just expand a little bit more on, examples of conjugal violence that maybe, aren't instantly thought of, maybe like micro versions of them or just normalized versions?
Well, one example, and it kind of touches on a couple of them, could be an immigrant family that just arrived here, and the woman is not working, the man is working, and he's physically abusive with her. She can't leave because she's financially dependent on him. So that pulls into play two versions, the physical abuse component and also the financial abuse component. So many people can't leave, or they don't want to leave, or they don't feel safe and comfortable leaving because they haven't worked. They don't have adequate schooling to be able to hold a job. They have been a stay-at-home parent for a while. So financial abuse is also very, very common. Another important one is emotional abuse. A lot of people think that just because someone isn't hitting you or abusing you physically, that it's not abuse. And emotional abuse cuts really deep because it just cuts you down as a person. And I mean, I can speak a little from my experience. I was in a relationship for just under a year, and the entire year, let's say, except for the first 3 months of the honeymoon phase, the first 3 months were fine. And then the whole rest of the time, it was all emotional abuse. It was bit by bit where you don't see it, and it got to the point where I was like always nervous. I was nervous about things that I shouldn't be nervous about, like working. Like he would pick a fight with me if I was working with a man. And it's like, this is my job, And so I was nervous about all of these things. And then the day that I decided that I didn't want to be part of this relationship anymore, I had had enough, then it got physical. So especially with emotional abuse, doesn't happen right away. And our tendency usually, and I'm saying women, but obviously it can be applied to any gender. But especially as women, we tend to want to justify certain things and be like, oh, they're not really like that, or oh, they just had a bad day at work or something like that, but that's not what love is. Love would never make you feel that and then make you feel super happy after, and it's tough because it's different for everyone. I mean, everyone experiences different things. However, the abuser always has that one element of control. So they can control with financial, they can control with emotional abuse, they can control physically. I'm not sure if you saw the Netflix show Made. That was, I think, one of the best pieces of it's a show, so not a film, but one of the best demonstrations of emotional abuse that I've ever seen on a screen in my life. It followed her story of being financially dependent on him, and how after she left, she's trying to build up on her own, get her job, but she can't apply for certain government things if she doesn't have proof of a job, and she can't get a job if she doesn't have proof of XYZ, So it really builds on how difficult it is for survivors to survive outside of that relationship. And one thing in that show really, really stuck with me. It was said by a woman who was in the shelter that the woman who the show follows was in. And she said, before they bite, they bark, meaning that before the abuser touches you physically, they say a lot, they scream a lot, they raise their temper essentially. And before they hit you, they hit near you. So they don't necessarily have to hit you first. They can punch the wall that you're standing right in front of, or they can throw something and not necessarily hit you, but close to you, And a lot of women, a lot of people who are in these situations stay because they didn't hit them. But as history shows, as all of our stories show, it's not just going to stay there. Like, he might not have hit you tonight, but what about tomorrow night? It's always going to escalate, So it's important to identify that and to believe that, because when you're in that situation and if there are children involved, if there are feelings involved, it's hard. It's hard when you love someone. It's hard when you have a child with someone. So you just have to look at it almost objectively, as if it was a friend going through something like this and not necessarily you, because you can be blinded by a lot or try to convince yourself that it's not this, but I mean, it will get worse. There's no situation where it doesn't get worse.
Mm-hmm. And it's almost kind of like as a result of the patriarchy, women are constantly gaslit, that in these situations, it's almost common that we gaslight ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
not to diminish the situation, not realizing what's actually going on.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite words is gaslighting. It's so common. And I mean, it can apply to any kind of relationship also, not just an intimate partner relationship, but that's also something that happened with me too, is that my ex would say something and then literally right after be like, oh, I didn't say that, you're making it up. And it makes you feel like you're crazy. It makes you feel like, well, maybe I didn't hear it properly, or maybe this, or maybe that. But when it comes to these abusers, it is what it is. You can't sugarcoat, you can't dissect, you can't justify. It is what it is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you so much. I guess for anyone who's watching this and these kind of experiences are resonating to them, seeming similar to things they're going through, what do you recommend as the first step to get out of it?
It really is a case-by-case situation. Some people are not living with their abusers, so of course they have a bit of free time on their hands. I would just say start a plan. Write a list, abuser aside, write a list of things that you want to accomplish for yourself in your life. Just start with you. Start with things that you want to get done in your life. And this will kind of give you a little bit of self-confidence and kind of like boost you a little, because a lot of people stuck in these situations, they have been continuously chipped away. Their self-confidence, self-esteem has been chipped away slowly. And a lot of times abusers isolate their victims also. So they might not be able to be around their friends, or they might not be able to be around their family. So it's important to try to build yourself up as much as possible. Any little bit helps, like if you enjoy meditating, do that for 5 minutes a day, even if you can just do it for 5 minutes, but start making a plan. If you live with the person, obviously it's a bit tougher. But if you do have people who you can trust and who you can talk to, reach out to them. And I mean, as long as you're comfortable, you don't have to say exactly everything of what you're going through, but you can reach out to them and just say, like, I need help, I need support. This is a bit about my situation. I want something different for myself, and just reach out. And we're at Women Aware, we're trying to, on top of the prevention, we're trying to encourage people that if somebody does reach out, to just be there for them. And I think it's human tendency that once somebody reaches out to you with a problem, you instantly kind of want to fix or help or kind of take control of the whole situation, but this type of situation needs to be handled delicately. So you can't just go in and be like, okay, so I'm going to do this, this, and this for you. You kind of have to go at their speed. But the most important thing is just to make yourself known as someone who will help whenever they deem themselves ready to start the process. And of course, the age-old saying, like, if you see something or hear something, you say something. You don't know whose life you're saving. You don't know what's going on, but if there's a possible chance that you could try to assist in any way, it would be great. But going back to what a survivor can do, it's important that you prioritize your safety. So if you're doing Google searches on helplines, you can call, by all means do it, but also erase your internet history. If you're calling a hotline or a helpline, erase that from your call log. If you are talking to someone who's helping you, that you want to talk to regularly, that you feel safe enough to talk to regularly, save their number under like hair salon or something like that, so that it's not as noticeable in your phone if somebody is checking your phone all the time. But the biggest piece of advice I could ever give is just to know that you're not alone. Even if you feel like you are, you're not alone, and there are resources and people who want to help. And it's going back to that show Made. You see that people go to the shelters, they get out of the situation, and then they go back. And even the person running the shelter said that she went back 7 times. So it does happen. It does happen because, especially if you're financially dependent or you have children, it does happen where you go back, but that doesn't make you less of a human, less of a person. It doesn't mean that you can't try again, you know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Chanel. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think is important to discuss or share?
No, you asked really good questions, like usual.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for making the time. It's always such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for covering this. It's a tough subject to talk about, but I'm always happy to talk about it because the more it can get out, the better it is for anyone listening, you know?
Mm-hmm. 2 weeks ago, a sex worker was killed in what was deemed a murder-suicide in the neighborhood of Mile End in Montreal. Stella, an organization by and for sex workers, said that the 25-year-old victim was an escort, likely working independently. She met up with a man whose name was known among the sex worker community in Montreal as someone to be cautious around or avoid. So, what are the risks that sex workers face on a regular, and how do they practice safe sex work using a list of clients to avoid? Video journalist Aude Simon spoke with Misha Shadlou from the Center for Gender Advocacy regarding the decriminalization of sex work.
My first question was regarding, we met last week, and we talked about the criminalization of sex work, and we also talked about it in relation to a sex worker that was recently murdered, and how the client was someone that was said to be very dangerous in the community. So could you talk more about this?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think the first thing to sort of think about is that the landscape for sex workers' rights since 2014, since Bill C-36 was put in place, is one that represents a lot of violence and conservative policy. Bill C-36 is inspired by the Nordic model, but it's actually worse. It was part of a larger bill on exploited persons, and what it looks to do is criminalize the communication aspect of selling sexual services. The idea behind the Nordic model is to reduce demand and to criminalize the client, but unfortunately that's not how it works out, and that's not how it worked out with Bill C-36. Because it's looking to criminalize the communication of selling sexual services aspect, it puts the onus back on the sex worker as the criminal for the person doing the communicating, and it re-empowers the client. So it re-empowers the people buying it because they're not actually the ones being criminalized. And with this particular caveat of C-36, it's particularly damaging to street-based sex workers because what they found now is that before, if the car was to pull up, they would be able to take the time to walk up to the car, look at the guy, check out the car, see if there was anything sort of not right, if the friend was close by to take down the license plate. Now they're unable to do that. Now they have to get in the car really quickly for fear of being caught by police and being criminalized that way. It also has ramifications for if you were to advertise online or indoors. It criminalizes a third-party aspect. So if you're working with an agency or anything like that, those people could be put in trouble and criminalized. And then the way you advertise online has to be very covert. It's on very sort of difficult to navigate websites. So that's sort of the caveat of C-36 that is really troubling and is like continuing to criminalize sex workers. So in relation to the recent murder case, I think what's interesting about it, what's sad about it, is the fact that he was a known aggressor. People in the sex worker community did already know about him, but because sex workers continue to be criminalized, they still have to work in the shadows. They're still pushed off to the margins. So that particular worker obviously didn't know that for whatever reason. Maybe she wasn't connected to other people. She's in a different part of Quebec too. So she obviously didn't know that, and she obviously wasn't, connecting, and so she got killed. What I want to say about that is that it led me to discover Marie-Laine Levesque, who was murdered last year. She was murdered by someone who had been in prison for 15 years, who he murdered. His name was Eustachio Galilei or something like this, and he was in prison for 15 years for murdering his wife. He was out on parole, and part of the risk management plan for him was that he was encouraged by his parole officer to seek out sexual services, and he became obsessed with this sex worker, and he murdered her. He stabbed her 57 times. So obviously there's a glaring hypocrisy in that, because the government and systems in place are criminalizing sex workers, and yet they're encouraging prisoners to go out and seek these sexual services as part of a risk management plan. And I just think I have so many questions. The actual main thing I want to say is that sex workers are not a buffer between criminals or men who have done violent things and the good women of society. I think that's part of the narrative here that led to this young woman's murder. Sex workers are not a buffer, and they shouldn't be treated as such, and they shouldn't be part of any risk management plan without their consent. I would find it very hard to believe that this woman knew about this and knew what the parole officer was saying. And I think it's like entirely unacceptable that that happened. And then, yeah, obviously the glaring hypocrisy of the fact that we're in a government that criminalizes this aspect, but chose to use it for this offender. And when asked to comment, the Canadian Correctional Services and the parole board, none of them have commented. I wouldn't be surprised if this parole officer is still working, and I have so many questions for the layers of people that made that decision, because ultimately there does need to be some accountability and culpability, and I can't understand what that decision was. In the case of the case that happened last month, I also want to say that that guy Daniel Schlafman is the son of a prominent businessman in Montreal. The power dynamics here are really glaring to me. We have the son of a prominent businessman in Montreal. We have the power dynamic of the parole board and the parole officer and the correctional services. But ultimately what this is doing is this is leading to a lack of accountability and deaths of these young women. I have to say that some statistics I know is that the median age for sex workers is 28. I think the statistic I have is that between 91 and 2014, there were 294 cases of homicide where the victim was a sex worker, and only 34% of those cases have been solved. So yeah, those are some really actually quite shocking numbers when we think about what's actually happening here, which is that young women in their early 20s are being killed.
People who often find themselves doing sex work will be people who are already marginalized. So migrants, I don't know if I'm saying it properly, but also people of color, and also trans people who often find themselves being sex workers. So again,
exactly that. After Bill C-36 was implemented, 11 migrant sex workers from Ottawa were arrested and deported, and we're continuously sort of seeing when we have police presence involved in sex work, it's leading to things like deportations, arrests, ongoing criminalization. You're absolutely right that people who enter into sex work are probably doing so for a multitude of reasons. I think I'm uninterested in narratives around sex work being empowering or the same as other labor. There are definitely aspects to sex work that are different to being a barista or something like that. But the ultimate fact of it is that it's work, and that we need to start creating the conditions where people aren't so coerced into poverty or, marginalization that they choose sex work unless they really want to. Most people aren't choosing to have a job, because they feel so passionately about it, whether that be sex work, working as a barista, even doing nonprofit work, whatever like that. People enter into sex work for all number of reasons. What we need to be doing is making sure that those people are safe, that those people do have access to the resources around them, and that they're not being criminalized unnecessarily, right? What was it? What else did I sort of write down? I think it's also really essential, and maybe this is obvious, but it's really essential to understand that the legislative policies around sex work have a direct implication on how sex workers can navigate in the world, which I think the way legislative policies sometimes operate in our day-to-day, it's more invisibilized. But when it comes to sex work, it has a direct impact on getting a house, getting other jobs, getting ID, getting healthcare services, being treated well in society, being able to access community resources. The case with Daniel Schlafman and that sex worker is that people knew about it, and obviously she didn't, right? Because we put the onus on some very small organizations that are sometimes, difficult to access, or hard to access because you're being criminalized, because that girl was working in the shadows, because she was being criminalized. She obviously felt she couldn't access the resources around her, was unable to, or unaware of them, or whatever it was. And so she wasn't alerted to the fact that Daniel Schluffman was already a known aggressor. So I think that's really part of it.
Yeah. You also talked about how you are not for the empowerment of sex work. Is that what you said, or something alike? And I know that in the recent years, if we can say, even like with TikTok, this is something that's quite romanticized on TikTok. You know, like you want to make money, like find yourself, you know, sell this, do that. Would you
I think TikTok shows us, I've thought a lot about this as well. Like, I think TikTok shows a really idealized form, a really, the money people are making and the glitz and the glam. Any sex worker knows that that's not accurate. It's a kind of inaccurate portrayal. And I'm not sure where that comes from. I think it probably comes from a lot of places. I think sometimes sex workers feel like if they can't admit that there are aspects to it that are challenging or that are difficult, that it will sort of be commandeered by abolitionists, by what we call sex worker exclusionary radical feminists. And so you go the opposite way of trying to talk about how great it is. Because if you are to add in that nuance can be weaponized by people that ultimately have a politic that's not in the best interest and that's not accurate. Work is not empowering. Doing labor for money just so you can feed yourself is not empowering, no matter what that labor is. So that's my thought on that. I also want to say that Amnesty International put out a 100-page report recently looking at the ways in which the Nordic model ultimately continues to criminalize the sex worker, ultimately leads to discrimination and violence and things like this. And so I just think we need a decriminalization of this labor. And there's been some successes in terms of like harm reduction across Canada recently, and I think we need to entwine the sex worker labor rights struggle within that. So, yeah, people aren't educated on the dangers because these bills like Bill C-36, like these criminalization policies, they criminalize a third party, they criminalize third party support. They make it very challenging for social services to support those people. So yeah, those people are going into this work thinking that it's easy or thinking that it might be some easy money, and they're not getting adequate support because those third parties, they're criminalized. If we are to decriminalize those third-party supports and we're to put more money into social services and things supporting these women, then maybe less women would actually be going into sex work because they would be more educated on the issue.
Perfect. Also, last time when we talked, you also mentioned being for the decriminalization of sex work, but not for its legalization. Could you speak more on that?
I think I'm not for the legalization of it because it would still be able to criminalize. Even if you legalize it, we'll still be able to criminalize workers within it. Sex work needs to not be a criminal issue. It needs to not be a legislative issue. It needs to just be a form of labor that has labor rights, that the legality or the criminalization of it is totally irrelevant. You can legalize it, but then you can still criminalize workers within it, whether that be the migrant person or the drug user or whatever have you. So the legalization question is kind of irrelevant in that regard.
Could you talk about why would like a sex worker, for example, decide to work independently rather than with organizations, and like just to make it clearer for anyone who's watching?
The reason why a sex worker would choose to work independently is for like a number of reasons. It's what they prefer is probably the biggest one. If you're working, for example, at like an erotic massage place, you have to maybe like give a room fee, you have to tip out to the place. And that's another thing with Bill C-36 is that it criminalizes that. But a lot of people choose that option because you don't have to work independently, because you don't have to do your own advertising, and because there is an extra level of protection when you have people around you. But people might choose to work independently because they can make more money, because there's a different degree of independence, because they don't have to give money over to the agency or the massage place or whatever. I think those would be the biggest reasons, because people can choose their own hours more flexibly, things like that. It's ultimately preference. It's ultimately how people are finding what works for them and how they make their money.
I know that like a sex worker we had talked to, because I also work at the link, had mentioned how advocating for decriminalization of sex work will also help people who want to, for example, exit the industry.
Exactly that, yeah.
Because it will help create more services for people to do it safely. Do you have anything to say on that, or?
Well, that's exactly it. Decriminalization will support women in exiting the industry because they won't be seen to have done a criminal thing. So, it won't affect their employment in the same ways as it does now. Because there's a lot of surveillance and criminalization on third-party resources. Like I said, they're spread thin. So if there's more money and more lack of criminalization around those services too, there's more ability to support women in exiting that industry. There's just more support if you don't criminalize those services too. If we decriminalize it and we start to normalize it into the labor market, if you can more easily take it to a landlord, if it's not okay, like for right now, if you were to tell your landlord you're a sex worker, they could easily evict you. There's often a lot of clauses in leases that say this isn't for the purpose of sex trade activity. If those things are taken out of like clauses in leases, and you can more freely have those conversations without fear of punitivity from landlords, from employers, from things like this, yeah, it's going to make it easier to exit the industry. You know what I mean? So she's totally right. The sex worker can be really scary for a number of reasons. A lot of people's families don't know. A lot of people's families would take it the wrong way. And again, and then it also, if you have another job, it could impact your employment there. And yeah, stigma, like people don't understand what sex work is or how it functions. And they don't understand that the people that see sex workers are everyday men. They're like men that we know, that we're related to, that we love and care for. So, I think people don't understand this fact, and they don't understand how it functions. And so because of that unknown, there's always, people create fear. There's always fear in the unknown in this way. And then there are, of course, like the old sort of stereotypes that I think are embedded in our society, that they're dirty, that they spread disease, blah, 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 blah. It's not true. It's just not. So I think that's probably a lot of the reasons why women choose not to say something or do so really fearfully. And, when it comes to Marie-Hélène Levesque, or the woman who was murdered last month, I really hope that their families are finding peace, and that their families that they don't feel shame that this is what their daughters were doing, because there's nothing shameful about it. These were obviously smart, intelligent, industrious women just trying to sort of get by and do whatever it was they were doing, and they didn't deserve to be killed for it at all. And yeah, there was nothing wrong with what they were doing. Ultimately, what I do want to say too, that I think it could be good for you to include, is that it's evident from this case that happened last month, it's evident from the case that happened last year, and it's evident from all of the numbers we see on sex worker murders, that the police, the government, the parole boards, all of them don't keep sex workers safe. Community and other sex workers keep sex workers safe. And a very unfortunate thing happens where like underfunded, burnt out organizations have the entire onus to take care of this population. But if anyone wants to come to the Center for Gender Advocacy for support, for referral to other sort of organizations, for just like active peer listening, or for anything that they may need, and if anyone is doing any advocacy on anything that happened with Marie-Hélène Levesque last year, I think that they're more than welcome to reach out to the center. We can amplify what they're doing, support them in their work, and like we have sex workers' backs, and we're right there with them. Their peers are here.
Local 514 is looking to expand. That means hearing from you, Montreal. Want to join the news team and produce a news package? Want to host a segment on air? Contact CUTV Montreal to find out more information. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday at 7 p.m. on CUTV Montreal's Facebook page to watch the newest episode of Local 514. Follow us on social media to see highlights of our episode at CUTV Montreal on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and follow us on YouTube at Local 514. Thanks for tuning in and see you next time.